Hi, Gen Psych class. Last time we were talking about conditioning. In particular, we mostly talked about what's called classical conditioning. And if you remember, conditioning is when you learn something by association. It's a type of training, right? That it's almost an unconscious learning. And in the case of classical conditioning in particular, one of the things that you're learning, or the thing that you're learning, is to expect something to come after a particular stimulus, right? Remember that classical conditioning was about that stimulus and response relationship, such that one stimulus can cause a certain response. If you had a chance to look at the video that I linked in the last description, where the guy trains his roommate to react to the easy button, you might have seen how this can take effect in addition to the way that we talked about with Pavlov's dog. In that particular case, the stimulus was the easy button, and the eventual conditioned response was the roommate's flinching to just the easy button, right? Whereas before he had to actually flinch to the shot. By the end of that take, by the end of his experiment, you saw that he was flinching just to the sound of that button. So again, classical conditioning is about setting up that expectation relationship. What about operant conditioning? Operant conditioning is more about getting someone or something to increase or decrease a certain type of behavior. So in the case of a plant, I think I mentioned last time, incorrectly saying that a plant was being classically conditioned, and I corrected myself to say that no, in fact, it's a type of operant conditioning, because you're getting the plant to increase its likelihood of facing in a certain direction. Well, how's that happening? So let's look at the components of operant conditioning. You can already see I've got my 2x2 matrix drawn up. And so there's going to be two sets of two terms similar to classical conditioning, except these terms will be different. So the terms that we have for operant conditioning include positive and negative, and reinforcement and punishment. I know it might be tough to see some of these things, especially if you're watching on a phone or something, so I'm trying to say the words out loud so that you can follow along and at least know what I'm writing. So here for operant conditioning, we have positive and negative, and then we have a reinforcement and we have a punishment. So what do these words mean, and how can we combine them to get an understanding of this type of conditioning? Well, first, let's take a look at positive and negative. And you're going to have to empty your brain of everything that you think you know about positive and negative, because when it comes to conditioning, they have a very specific meaning. They mean something that you don't necessarily see with the words in other cases. So here in operant conditioning, positive means that I'm going to give you something. It means just that. I'm going to give something to you. So don't understand it as necessarily good or necessarily bad. It just means giving. Positive means I'm going to give you something, and so negative means I'm going to take something away. So we'll go ahead and write these words on the top of our matrix: positive and negative. And so the other part of operant conditioning, really the main part, is the reward and the punishment, or the reinforcement and the punishment. So when a reinforcement is applied, this just means that a behavior will increase. This is the definition of a reinforcement. A reinforcement means that a behavior will increase. Reinforcements always increase behavior. Reinforcements always increase behavior. This is important because sometimes we might give something that we think of as a reward, or we think of as positive, not in these cases, but we think of as good, and it's actually neutral to the person we're giving it to, or maybe it's even a punishment. An example of this might be if one of you did really good on a test and we were still in conventional class. What if I called you up on stage and said, hey, I want to reward you for doing such a good job on this last test. I want to let everybody in the class know how good of a student you are, what good grades you're making, how awesome of a person you are in general. Well, for some of you, that's going to be a real reinforcement. You're going to say, yeah, the professor's noticing me, he's putting me up on stage so everybody else can know who I am. That's awesome. And so in that case, it would be a reinforcement. It would cause you probably to increase the likelihood that you're going to make good grades because you liked that feeling, you liked that attention. Now, others of you, right, some of you introverts out there would absolutely hate that. You would absolutely hate being recognized in that way. And so even though I am trying to do it as some type of reward, it might actually serve as a punishment to you. Spoiler alert as to what a punishment's about. Because it might actually make you less likely to make good grades because you're saying, hey, I don't want that type of attention. I'll just be a B student if being an A student means he's going to put me on stage and make everybody look at me. Geez. And so a reinforcement always increases behavior. Whether you mean it to or not, it will always increase behavior. So how about a punishment? Well, you might have figured out already, right, that a punishment then is to decrease a behavior. Punishments always decrease behavior. So in the same way that a reinforcement, something that you mean to be a reinforcement, can actually turn out to be a punishment, something that you mean to be a punishment could also turn out to be a reinforcement. A very classic example of this might be a kid who's attention seeking, and so they're acting up, and you get a parent or a teacher who is trying to quiet that kid down and maybe yelling at them such that they'll not do that anymore. Excuse me. But in fact, what happens is that the kid really likes that attention. This won't happen in all cases, but it does happen, that the kid actually likes that attention, and so you're yelling at them, you're giving them this kind of negative attention, this bad attention, actually is a reinforcement to them, right? It's probably the same kid who would enjoy being called up on stage, right? They just want to be noticed in that way, and so even though you mean it as a punishment, it actually serves as a reinforcement. So these things can go either way, but the main thing to understand is that they are what they are. If it increases behavior, it's a reinforcement. If it decreases behavior, it's a punishment. So let's write along this side, reinforcement and punishment. And so now we can fill in this matrix of a positive reinforcement, a positive punishment, a negative reinforcement, and a negative punishment. So what do these things mean? So if we look at a positive reinforcement, this is probably the most simple case and the one that you can maybe think of examples of most easily. And that's because really what it is just giving somebody a reward in the hopes that they'll keep doing what they're doing or that they'll do what they were doing more. So what does this look like? Well, this might be, say, your parents saying, hey, I'm going to give you some money if you continue to do well in school, despite having to take all these classes online, right? So they want you to increase or continue a good behavior, and they're doing that by offering you a reward, by offering you something that you want. A positive punishment, of course, is going to be the opposite of that. That is to say, I'm going to give you something in this case, but in this case, it's going to be something you don't want. And my hope here is that you will decrease that behavior. So let's say that your parents don't want you, I don't know, showing up past your curfew. Let's say you've got a 1 a.m. curfew. And so your parents don't want you showing up after that, but you do it anyway. And so in order to decrease that behavior, they give you something you don't want. Now, if you've got a curfew, you're probably not getting spankings, maybe you are, but that would be an example of a positive punishment. I'm giving you something, in this case it's pain, I'm giving you something you don't want in order to decrease behavior. You might also do something like giving chores, right? You have to go mow the neighbor's yard, or you have to clean up the whole basement or something like that, right? I'm giving you something, again, in order to decrease a behavior. Punishments always decrease behavior, and because it's positive, that means I'm going to give you something. and in this case it'll be something you don't want. Keep that in mind. It's something you do want in the case of positive reinforcement, and something you don't want in the case of negative reinforcement, because we're going to get a little tricky here when we look at the negative versions of these things. So in the case of a negative reinforcement, this means I'm taking something away. I'm taking something away from you in order to increase a behavior. Now, think for a second, what type of thing do I need to take away from you in order to increase a behavior? Is it going to be something you wanted, or is it going to be something you didn't want? Well, it's probably going to be something you didn't want. In the case of a negative reinforcement, generally, I'm going to take something away that you don't like. I'm going to take something away that's annoying. I'm going to take something away that's painful or frustrating or making you angry in order to get you to increase a certain behavior. An example of this might be a teacher taking away a test grade or taking away a test such that if you do well on the previous test, or if you do well on a certain paper or assignment, maybe I'd say, hey, I'm going to take away your next final or your next exam because you did so well. Well, in that case, I'm taking away something you didn't want anyway, and that's going to make you more likely, that's going to make it more likely that you increase the behavior that I want, which is for you to do well in the class. Now, in the case of a negative punishment, actually, let me give you one more set of examples for negative reinforcement, because there's a lot of ways in which kind of non-adults, non-humans will use negative reinforcement since they can't communicate, or in some cases they're honestly just not intelligent enough to do much more. Not that this is the dumbest of the types of reinforcement, but it's one that doesn't require much to get done. And here's how that works. So your car negatively reinforces you in a couple ways, both with dings. One is the ding that you hear if you leave your lights on when you get out of the car or when you turn the car off. And the other is the ding that you hear if you don't put your seatbelt on when you turn the car on. Both of these things are annoying sounds, and the way they're reinforcing you is by getting you to want that sound to stop, so you put your seatbelt on or you remember to turn your lights off, and the sound, the annoying thing, gets taken away and thereby increases the likelihood that you'll turn your lights off when you turn your car off, and you'll put your seatbelt on when you turn your car on. So negative reinforcement. Negative punishment, again, flipping this on its head, think about the idea of taking something away in order to decrease a behavior. So with negative punishment, you're going to take something away in order to decrease a behavior. Now, similarly with negative reinforcement, you have to think about what type of thing would I take away in order to decrease a behavior. Well, in this case, it's going to be something that you didn't want. It's going to be something that you did want. If I'm taking something away as a punishment, it's got to be something that you value. It's got to be something that you wanted to have. So instead of being punished, for instance, for coming home late from curfew by giving you chores, what I might do instead is take away your phone or take away your car, right? Those also serve as punishments, that is to say, those also serve as ways of getting you to decrease that behavior of coming home after curfew. So negative punishment, much like negative reinforcement, you have to think about what are you going to take away in order for that behavior to either increase or decrease. In the case of reinforcement, it's got to be something that you didn't want to have anyway, so taking it's a good thing. In the case of negative punishment, it's got to be something that you did want, so taking it away is a bad thing. So next time, what we're going to talk about is how we can use these schedules in order to get somebody to either learn these behaviors really quickly or to get them to learn those behaviors such that they last for a very long time. I'll see you then.